Welcome to Outside the Box. My name's Mike Desch. I'm the director of the Notre Dame International Security Center, and I'm the co-host of this podcast. Jim Webb is on sick leave today. 2 weeks ago or so, the Israeli daily Haaretz had a big piece on the essential books you need to read to understand the current situation in Gaza. The piece had a picture, in fact. It was like a table in a bookstore with a bunch of the books that they were recommending piled up. And right in the middle of that pile was our guests, John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt's 2008 book, The Israel Lobby. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He's the author of many other books, too many to mention today. A graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and a veteran of both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. His partner in crime on the Israel lobby and many other things is Stephen Walt, the Robert and Renee Belfer professor at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's current professor there, former academic dean. Prior to Harvard, Steve taught at Chicago and at Princeton, and at one point in his career did a stint at the Center for Naval Analyses. It's been 18 years since the Israel lobby broke. How did I calculate that? The book came out in 2008, but I'm counting it back to the first iteration of it, which was the 2006 Kennedy School working paper. And so I thought maybe the first question to ask you guys, because over 18 years, period in which a lot of our students, for example, weren't even born. The basic argument of the Israel lobby may not be all that familiar to at least some of our listeners. So can you briefly summarize it for us and talk about it in the context also of the current Gaza crisis?
Well, that's a tall order by itself. Let me take the first swing at this, and then John can correct everything I leave out or anything I get wrong. The central argument of the original article and the subsequent book was that American Middle East policy was heavily shaped by domestic politics, and in particular by the various political activities of a loose coalition of groups that we labeled the Israel lobby. And we can talk more about exactly what that definition entails. And the basic argument was that the relationship between the United States and Israel was unprecedented. There was no similar relationship between the United States and any other country. It was a special relationship where the United States gave Israel enormous amounts of economic, military, and diplomatic support, and did so more or less unconditionally, regardless of what Israel's conduct was. And that, while one could have justified that in previous decades by arguing Israel was a strategic asset and by saying that the two countries had shared values, common democracies, etc., we argued that both of those arguments were less and less persuasive over time. Israel was less of a strategic asset, and American values and Israeli values were diverging sharply, particularly as a result of the long occupation of the West Bank and the treatment of the Palestinians. And so how could you explain the consistence of this relationship, and in particular the fact that it kept getting deeper, more extensive, more generous, higher levels of support? And we argued this was mostly due to the lobby and its ability, like other interest groups in American society, to steer American policy in a particular direction, so that the United States backed Israel no matter what it did. And politicians, by and large, would say nothing about this, would never criticize Israel, etc. That it was in a unique position in the body politic, and that was due primarily to the activities of the lobby.
John, who is in the lobby?
Before I answer that, Mike, let me just embellish Steve's comments, make just a few additional comments on what he had to say. First of all, it's very important to understand that the key issue that the lobby focuses on is the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. And that's the issue on which they have the greatest influence. As Steve and I made clear in the article and then in the book, the Israel lobby doesn't win every time. This is an enormously powerful lobby, and it wins most of the time for sure, but it doesn't win all the time. But the one issue that it wins almost all the time on is the Palestinian issue, and that's the issue they care the most about. And that's why you see the lobby working overtime at this point in time regarding what's going on in Gaza. Another point that you want to keep in mind is that it is not a Jewish lobby. A lot of our critics like to label it as the Jewish lobby and make the claim that we wrote an article and then a book about the Jewish lobby. As we emphasized in both the article and the book, the lobby is not comprised of all Jews. In fact, there are a good number of Jews who don't care much at all about Israel. And there are a good number of Jews who are also deeply opposed to what Israel is doing with regard to the Palestinians, and therefore oppose Israeli policy. So not all Jews should be identified with the lobby. And furthermore, within the lobby, you have Christian Zionists who are obviously not Jews. So this is why we call it the Israel lobby, and we don't identify the lobby simply with Jews. Furthermore, it's very important to emphasize that the lobby works in two very different ways. This is a rather simple distinction that we make in the book, but it is a powerful and important one. The lobby, number one, tries to influence the discourse in the United States about Israel. And number two, it wields great influence in the policy process. In other words, the lobby goes to great lengths to influence how the White House and how Congress think and act toward Israel, right? And that's different than influencing the discourse, but there's no question that they influence the discourse as well. And when our book came out, and before that, when the article came out, they went to great lengths, they meaning the lobby went to great lengths to delegitimize our article and our book, because they saw it as a threat in the context of the discourse. But influencing the discourse and influencing the policy process are the two ways that the lobby wields its influence inside of the United States.
Great. That's very helpful. Maybe talk a little bit with reference to the current Gaza crisis about how you see the lobby affecting the discourse and the policy process, to sort of put flesh on those theoretical bones, if you could.
So, I mean, there's several things. First of all, when you're shaping the policy process in the executive branch, part of this is to make sure that sympathetic individuals are in key positions, and that people who might have a different view, want the United States to have a different set of policies, never get appointed to these senior positions. So if you look at the people who are responsible for American foreign policy in the Middle East now, none of them are people who have been critical of Israel in the past in any significant way. Those people are excluded from even consideration. You'd have trouble getting them confirmed on Capitol Hill, et cetera. So one way you shape policy is by shaping who's in the key jobs. And I think you see that, of course, in the way the Biden administration, the way Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who has openly declared himself, to be a longtime Zionist, et cetera, have reacted to this series of events. So that's sort of one element. The second thing you see, of course, is efforts by people who are in the lobby and lobbying groups to condemn anyone who is critical of what Israel is doing. So just to take one very visible example, the director of this film, Zone of Silence, who won the Academy Award, and then gave a speech saying that his Jewish identity shouldn't be hijacked, and the history of the Holocaust shouldn't be hijacked to defend what Israel is doing now. He immediately faces a firestorm of criticism for being, critical of what Israel is doing as well. It's just one, highly visible recent example of how discourse is being, if not controlled, because other voices do get out there, like this director. But the point is that they're going to face immediate censure, immediate criticism, and that's all designed to try and shape how Americans are viewing the conflict and are shaping American policy.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Steve said, it's important to distinguish between the mainstream media and the alternative media when we talk about the lobby's efforts to influence, maybe even control the discourse. In the mainstream media, the lobby is very effective. And all you have to do is look at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal supports Israel down the line. It supports the Netanyahu government down the line. There is hardly ever any meaningful criticism of Israel in the Wall Street Journal. It's quite remarkable. And this has been the case for a long time. And if you look at the New York Times, obviously the two key people on the editorial page who write about Israel are Tom Friedman and Bret Stephens. And both of them are deeply committed Zionists who are deeply committed to defending Israel as best they can. This is not to say that they don't occasionally criticize Israel, and this would certainly be more true of Tom Friedman than Bret Stephens, but nevertheless, they are staunch supporters of Israel. There is nobody on the op-ed page of the New York Times who criticizes Israel in any meaningful way, and certainly no one who does it, on a regular basis. Friedman and Stephens regularly write about Israel, especially given the present conflict in Gaza. But there's nobody else on the New York Times editorial page who does that. So Israel gets portrayed in a very favorable light as a result of the composition of writers on New York Times editorial page. So
I actually, John, I do want to correct you on one point. I mean, Nick Kristof, who writes for the Times regularly, has been critical over the past several months, but he's, I think, the only voice on the New York Times. And again, that suggests that this isn't a total monopoly on discourse, but the point is it's overwhelmingly on one side, and you get occasional voices on the other side.
I was not making the point that the Times was the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, but Nick Kristof's criticisms are milquetoast. He hardly criticizes Israel in a meaningful way, in my opinion. And this brings me to the whole subject of the alternative media. When you look at all these alternative media platforms and you look at the discourse in that realm regarding Israel, it is fundamentally different than what you see in the mainstream media. And this is a world in which someone like Nick Kristof looks like milquetoast. He's just not a serious critic, in my opinion, of Israel. And yes, the New York Times does allow him to occasionally say some words that are critical of Israel. But what you really need in the mainstream media are people who are critical of Israel, because there are huge numbers of pundits and intellectuals and former policymakers who are critical of Israel. They just can't get their voice heard in the mainstream media. But you can get your voice heard in the alternative media. And this is a huge problem for the lobby. And they are scrambling to do everything they can to control the alternative media. And you see this most clearly with regard to TikTok. There's no question that the lobby is going to enormous lengths to shut down TikTok, because TikTok is filled with pieces that are critical of Israel. And lots of young people get their news from TikTok, not from the Wall Street Journal and not from the New York Times. And therefore, unsurprisingly, you see much more criticism of Israel among young people than you do among older dogs like me, Steve, and you, Mike.
John and Steve, could you just, for our listeners, particularly younger listeners, name check some of the alternative media people that you follow or you appear on? Give some specific names and venues.
John should go ahead with that because he's, I think, probably more familiar with that genre than I am.
Well, I think the Judge Napolitano show, which I've appeared on numerous times, would be a good example of that. And then there is a show called The Duran, D-U-R-A-N, with Glenn Deason and Alexander McCurris, which I have appeared on a number of times. And there are a wide variety of other platforms where, I have been invited to talk in the alternative media.
Gray Zone, Mondo Weiss.
I was going to say, Mondo Weiss, the website there run by Phil Weiss, it would be one example as well. And if you also looked at publications like The Nation magazine, much more likely to have articles that are hard-hitting and critical of Israel as well, and on other issues as well. So there are places within the media environment, but they're not the central mainstream platforms with, big circulations and a certain prestige within the journalistic world.
Yeah, just mentioning the Gray Zone, I was going to get to that. The Gray Zone is a very important alternative media outlet. And on the whole subject of the rape charge on October 7th, Israel and its supporters have maintained that there was a systematic rape of Israelis on October 7th by Hamas and others who came into Israel from Gaza. And people who work for the Gray Zone, like Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate, and then Mondo Weiss with Phil Weiss, and the Electronic Intifada with Ali Abu Niba, and a handful of other outlets have gone to great lengths to show that there is no evidence of systematic rape on October 7th, despite what Israel and its supporters say. So you actually have this real battle that takes place inside the United States regarding what happened with regard to the systematic rape charge on October 7th. You would not have that debate if there were no alternative media. If the mainstream media controlled the discourse about what happened on October 7th, there would be no reason to question whether there had been systematic rape on October 7th.
So in terms of shaping the discourse, just on the October 7th and current Gaza crisis, the perspective from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post would be unprovoked attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians, 1,200 Israelis murdered, crimes like the systematic use of sexual violence and rape were part and parcel of Hamas's strategy and the taking of hostages. So is that a good example of the role that you see the lobby in sort of shaping the larger discourse?
Yeah, I would just add to that also the sense that the sort of history began on October 7th, that the previous 40 or 50 years of Israeli-Palestinian relations are irrelevant. The fact that the Palestinians have been treated in a remarkably brutal fashion for a long, long time. Remember, the fundamental issue here is the fact that you have roughly 7.5 million Palestinian Arabs and roughly 7.5 million Israeli Jews essentially cohabitating or commingled within the same territory. So controlled by Israel, but with these two roughly equal populations, where one population is largely denied all political rights or has its rights severely infringed, and the other one rules supremely. And that's the political issue, and that goes back, to the founding of the State of Israel, actually, and certainly since 1967 on the West Bank and in Gaza. What the popular discourse of this would like to say, well, this horrible thing happened on October 7th. And, let's be clear, what Hamas did is, in my view, a war crime, attacking innocent civilians. But that's not where this history started. This history started well before that. If you just read the Israeli accounts of this, they would like to start the clock on October 7th and deal with those events without talking about the more fundamental political problems that lie beneath it.
He, of course, is absolutely right that the Israelis and their supporters in the United States don't want to talk about what happened before October 7th and want to focus exclusively on October 7th. They also don't want to talk about what's happened after October 7th. And whenever you get into discussions about what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians after October 7th, Israel and its supporters try to bring you back to October 7th. So from Israel's point of view and its defenders' point of view, the name of the game is to focus exclusively on what happened on October 7th. And furthermore, to make all sorts of charges against Hamas that make it look like they are extreme barbarians. And this is not to say that that Hamas did not commit what we would call war crimes on October 7th. I'm not denying that. But the number of charges that have been made against Hamas for what it did on October 7th that are not correct are quite significant. And this involves the rape charge, the beheading of babies, the argument that women had babies cut out of their womb, and so forth and so on. Again, I don't want to deny that Hamas did commit war crimes on October 7th, but exactly what happened on October 7th is not clear. And it's very important that at some point in the near future, we get a good sense of what exactly happened. And just to take this one step further, it's important to understand that a good number of the Israelis who were killed on October 7th were killed by Israelis because the Israelis invoked the Hamas doctrine on October 7th.
You mean the Hannibal doctrine?
Yes, excuse me, the Hannibal doctrine on October 7th. And the Hannibal doctrine says that from Israel's point of view, it is unacceptable for Hamas or the Palestinians to capture Israelis and hold them as hostage. And in those instances, it makes more sense to kill the Israelis who are possible hostages rather than allow Hamas to take them back into Gaza. So the Israelis actually killed a good number of Israeli citizens on October 7th. We don't know what the number is. And I'm not implying that the majority of Israelis who were killed that day were killed by the IDF. That's not my argument. But there is nevertheless evidence that the IDF did kill a good number of Israelis. We'd like to know what that number is. We'd like to have some sort of systematic analysis of who was raped and whether or not there was a campaign of rape on the part of Hamas. All these are terribly important issues that need to be examined. But Israel, up to now, has had a vested interest in making the argument that the Palestinians alone killed huge numbers of civilians, and they committed crimes like beheading babies, beheading women, and so forth and so on, that really don't bear up if you look at what's being said in the alternative media.
Would you also include the fact that at least a third of the Israelis who were killed in the Hamas attack were IDF soldiers or security personnel, not exactly civilians?
Well, if you look at international law, there's no question that the Palestinians have a right to resist. And resistance involves killing military personnel on the other side, killing the occupiers. So I don't think you can make the argument that what Hamas did in terms of killing Israeli military personnel violates international law. I think it does not. But there's no question that killing innocent civilians is a violation of international law. And there's no question that Hamas murdered, if you want, innocent Israeli civilians. And that is wrong from a moral point of view, from the point of view of international law. And I don't condone that for 1 second. But there's also no question that the Palestinians, according to international law, have a right to resist the occupation.
So you guys have done a terrific job of sort of, fleshing out the shaping the discourse argument. I thought I'd ask you to talk just a little bit about influencing the policy making process, and thinking about, for example, the current situation with Rob Malley, or thinking, historically about Senator Chuck Hagel's sort of aborted nomination to be Secretary of Defense. Are these examples of how the lobby shapes the policy-making process? Steve, do you want to take that one?
As I said earlier, that one of the key things is to make sure that people who are sympathetic don't get important jobs. And there have been a number of cases in the past where people have been nominated for important positions and ran afoul of the lobby. For example, President Obama wanted to appoint Chaz Freeman, a very experienced, knowledgeable American diplomat, to head the National Intelligence Council. But because Freeman had been critical of Israel in a number of contexts in the past, it was clear he was going to face terrible opposition on Capitol Hill, and eventually he withdrew the nomination. So that's just one example of someone. In the case of Chuck Hagel, also, I think a good example would be Samantha Power. Both Hagel and Power were regarded as somewhat suspect by key groups in the lobby because of things they had said previously. And they basically had to go up on Capitol Hill and contort themselves into a pretzel, talking about how supportive of Israel they were in order to get confirmed into government positions. That actually, though, points to a critical aspect of the power of groups like AIPAC and others, and we haven't talked about it yet, and that's basically their role in American elections. AIPAC is not a PAC, a political action committee. It does not give money directly, but it has influence over a number of existing PACs. It's actually helped create some independent PACs, and it guides where that money goes. In fact, it often asks congressional candidates to answer a questionnaire and fill out, how they feel about Middle East issues to know if they're going to be certified as appropriate for support. And of course, everyone running for Congress knows this, that there's a lot of money that can either go to their opponents or can go to them as long as they're supportive of Israel. And of course, once they're on the AIPAC payroll or the payroll of the lobby for campaign contributions, then they'll also weigh in on issues like Gaza. They'll weigh in on appointments, et cetera. And there's many, many examples of the influence that AIPAC's been able to have over members of Congress. You see this, of course, in Biden's response to Gaza. And in some respects, Joe Biden is in a terrible position where he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. If he supports Israel to the hilt, which is pretty much what he's done, he's alienating Arab Americans, which is going to hurt him in some key states like Michigan, and he's also alienating progressives on the left of the Democratic Party who aren't going to be as enthusiastic, may vote for others. They may just stay home in the presidential election. So he's hurt by that politically. But if he goes the other way, if he starts putting lots of pressure on Israel, if he withdraws American support, suspends military aid, then he's going to lose support from Israel's supporters, and in particular from people who give large sums of money. Nobody knows exactly what these numbers are, but it is widely understood that American Jews, particularly American Jews who are strongly committed to Israel, give a lot of money in American political campaigns. And Biden has already been to some big fundraisers where major American donors have, ponied up millions of dollars for his campaign, and he risks losing that if he goes the other way. And of course, this has happened for many, many years. It's, I think, well understood, and it's one of the key sources of the lobby's power, like other interest groups in American politics that have deep pockets. And politicians understand that if you go up against big pharma, if you go up against the National Rifle Association, if you go up against the farm lobby, you're going to make your life much more difficult than it would be if you go along. And because there's no countervailing force on the other side here, there's no Arab American lobby with similar resources, similar deep pockets. The average politician who doesn't care one way or the other about Middle East issues knows what the smart political choice is. And that's a big part of the enduring power of some of these groups.
So both of you guys, came to fame as experts in international relations, and both of you have a particular POV as political realists, which who are not noted for paying much attention to domestic politics. But with the your engagement with the Israel lobby issue, you guys have gotten up to your ears in domestic politics. So how do you square your political realism and your interest in domestic politics and pluralist politics? John, maybe you could take that one.
Well, Steve and I are both realists, and we're both well known for having realist theories about how the world works. And our basic arguments, although our arguments are different, we both believe that the world works according to our theories most of the time, but not all of the time. No theory can account for every instance that the theory applies to. Theories are simplifications of reality. They're crude instruments, and they're right most of the time, according to the author of the theory. But no serious theorist would argue, that his or her theory is right all the time. Sometimes factors that you leave out of the theory really do matter. And I think there's no question that the case of the Israel lobby contradicts both my theory and Steve's theory, because it does focus on domestic politics, which is largely absent from our theories. So this is a case that contradicts, for lack of a better term, our basic theories. But in my opinion, this shows you why realism is the best way to act in international politics. We have theories that say that if you look at how the world works, the best way to maneuver around the obstacles in that world is to employ a realist theory. And if you don't employ a realist theory, you're going to get yourself into a well of a lot of trouble. And this is what's happened with regard to the U.S. relationship with Israel. The fact is that by supporting Israel unconditionally, we have gotten ourselves into a lot of trouble. All you have to do is look at what's happening in Gaza. Joe Biden fully understands that he is in deep trouble, that the United States is in deep trouble in the Middle East. And that's because of the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby makes it almost impossible for Joe Biden to get tough with Israel, when in fact Joe Biden wants to get tough with Israel because he thinks it's in the American national interest to do that. So if Joe Biden didn't have to deal with the lobby, and if Joe Biden was free to act as a realist in terms of the present conflict, the United States would be in much better shape. So that's, in a nutshell, our basic argument, I think.
Yeah, but I want to amplify that. I'm not willing to go as far as John in saying
I
that
was
this.
going to ask, you're not going to wear the full theoretical hair shirt on this, huh?
I don't think it actually contradicts realism as much as John just suggested. It's obviously an exception. But one key point here, of course, is that the United States is a very unusual country, right? Extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily secure. Realism is a theory that talks about all the constraints that states face living in a world of anarchy. But the United States, particularly in the unipolar moment, was at least partly insulated from a lot of those things. It could afford to do dumb things, right? Because it was in such a privileged position overall. So that's not the fact that the United States allowed its foreign policy to be shaped in powerful ways by the lobby. It's not entirely inconsistent with the realist perspective. Again, because we're so powerful, we can do certain things. But the second thing realism does say, and this is where John ended up, was if you don't follow realist precepts, you're going to pay a price for it. The system is going to punish you in a variety of ways. And I think we've seen that. We're certainly seeing that in Gaza now, where much of the world, and especially the global South, thinks the United States is behaving in a reprehensible fashion. And that's going to make it more difficult to elicit cooperation from them. But also, and this is something we talked about at great length in our book, the lobby was involved in a lot of other major foreign policy mistakes. Possibly the most controversial argument in the book was our claim that the lobby, and in particular the neoconservative movement, was instrumental in driving the United States to attack Iraq in 2003. It was not the only reason why the United States attacked Iraq. George W. Bush ultimately made that decision, etc. But it was a critical part of the story. And if you don't understand the role that the lobby played in helping persuade Bush to do that, and then helping sell the idea to the American people so it had some public support, you don't understand how we got involved in a war that cost us, thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. You could also argue that the lobby has made it virtually impossible for American governments to try and improve the relationship with Iran. Well, Iran has tried repeatedly, going back to the 1990s, to try and lower the temperature with the United States, reach out to us in a variety of ways. And every time that happens, the lobby has mobilized to make sure the United States kept Iran as isolated as possible. The lobby was strongly opposed to the nuclear deal with Iran in 2015 as well. So one of the reasons we have this horribly unproductive relationship with Iran is the influence of the Israel lobby. That's not to say Iran hasn't done some dumb things that have made this more difficult as well. But the point is, American policy on Iraq back in 2003, on Iran ever since the revolution, et cetera, would be substantially different if the United States, if American policymakers didn't have groups like AIPAC and others leaning over their shoulder and pushing them in other directions.
Yeah, if I can just
Please.
jump in and say a word or two about the Iran issue. If you look at the situation in the Middle East today, one of the big questions that immediately pops out is who is responsible for creating this disastrous situation? And when we talk about this disastrous situation, we're not simply talking about Gaza. We're talking about what's happening on Israel's northern border with regard to Hezbollah. We're talking about the war that the United States is now in with the Houthis. We're talking about the fact that the United States is being attacked by groups in both Iraq and Syria. So what's the basic cause of all of this trouble in the greater Middle East? And if you read what Israel and its supporters say, they blame Iran. Iran is the master puppeteer. And what Hamas did was obey Iran's dictates and attack Israel on October 7th. What Hezbollah is doing is evidence of Iran waging war against Israel, and so forth and so on. The Houthis are always identified with Iran. Iran is the master puppeteer, and therefore Iran is principally responsible for the disasters that we now see in the Middle East. The alternative scenario is that Israel is responsible. It's largely a result of the occupation that the Palestinians attacked Israel on October 7th. Hezbollah has made it clear that it is responding to what's going on in Gaza. And if the war in Gaza stopped, Hezbollah would stop attacking Israel. The same thing is true with the Houthis, and so forth and so on. So you have two possible interpretations of which country is principally responsible for driving conflict in the Middle East, Iran or Israel. In my opinion, the evidence is overwhelming that Israel is principally responsible for this disaster, and it is the occupation. It is the fact that Israel has become an apartheid state. And this is why every president since Jimmy Carter has gone to significant lengths to try to create a two-state solution, because they understood that if you didn't have a two-state solution, you'd have a first intifada, a second intifada, and October 7th. But of course, because of the lobby, it's been almost impossible for any president to make any progress in terms of getting a two-state solution. And the end result is you have these various disasters in the Middle East today that are tied to the occupation. And there is, in my opinion, little evidence that Iran is the master puppeteer and responsible for all these conflicts that are now going on.
You make the point in the book, and Steve made the point in his opening remarks, that the way the lobby operates is inextricably linked to the warp and woof of good old American pluralist interest group politics. That seems quite compelling to me, but it also raises a conundrum, which is, if it's so tied up with business as usual of our democratic political system, how do you fix it without, changing our political system, which I'm presuming neither of you would advocate? Is it hopeless? Is it just a bug in the otherwise positive features of American pluralism and democracy?
I'm somewhat optimistic about this, but we're a political system that was sort of designed not to change radically. It's hard to shift. I mean, you could certainly change a lot if you ended the way campaigns are financed, but that's an enormous issue, not likely to happen anytime soon. But here's why I'm optimistic. I'll point to two things. One we've already talked about, and that is that discourse has changed. I mean, for us, when we first wrote the original article and then the book, to even bring up the Israel lobby in public in explicit ways and talk about how it operated was very controversial. Using the phrase was controversial. That's not true anymore. People across the political spectrum will talk openly about the political clout that AIPAC has. We've talked about the New York Times. The New York Times had a big article a couple of weeks ago on how the lobby is facing more difficulties now in trying to defend the situation in Gaza. So in some respects, we help legitimate having a conversation about the political influence of these various groups in ways that what didn't happen before us. We wanted to break that taboo, and I think that's been accomplished. Second, because there are now more media outlets, as John described, information is flowing to people in ways that it didn't before. And finally, and this is related to that, there is a huge generational change going on here. Right? People who are much younger than John or I have grown up with a very different experience of the U.S. Israeli relationship. Their experience of Israel is not 1948. It's not making the desert bloom in the 1950s. It's not what we sometimes call the Leon Uris school of Israeli history, what they see is the occupation. They see the oppression of one group by another. And many younger Americans see it through that particular frame, even if they don't have any particular interest in the Middle East per se. So I think generational change is also driving a change in attitudes, and that's ultimately going to shape what happens in the political system as well, because people in Congress are going to have to pay attention to the votes of people who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s once people like John and I have left the stage, along with lots of people who are sort of instinctively supportive of Israel.
Yeah, let me make a couple points in addition to what Steve said. I think there's no question that the discourse has changed, and at the risk of sounding like I'm bragging, I think that Steve and I played a key role in changing the discourse when we wrote first the article and then the book. But the discourse can change, but the really important question is whether policy actually changes. And I think we would all agree that there has not been a significant change in American policy towards Israel. The lobby remains remarkably powerful. But of course, your question, Mike, had to do with the future. A couple points there. There's no question that in the body politic, views about Israel, especially among younger people, have changed significantly. There's much less sympathy for Israel among younger people than there used to be. And again, this is why the lobby is so interested with shutting down TikTok. But the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not that's going to matter at the elite level, because the elite level is where policy is formulated and executed. And what you have is a situation where I believe the lobby remains extremely effective at influencing how policymakers think and act towards Israel, even though down below, the discourse has caused a change. The discourse has changed in fundamental ways. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you believe that if the discourse changes even more moving forward, that change down below will manifest itself in important ways up at the policy level. Or do you believe, in contrast, that the lobby will be able to keep policymakers in line despite what's happening down below? I obviously hope that what happens down below puts pressure on people at the top and they change policy. I'm not terribly optimistic, probably more pessimistic than Steve. That's point number one. Point number two is one could make an argument that what you see happening here is that as time goes by, the Democratic Party is becoming more hostile to Israel and the Republican Party is becoming more supportive of Israel. And one could make an argument that at some point down the road, you will have a real difference of opinion on what our policy should be towards Israel between Democrats on one hand and Republicans on the other hand. It's very important to understand that 50% of the people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, this is 50%, believe that the Israelis are committing genocide in Gaza. That's a really stunning figure. There is a great deal of hostility inside the Democratic Party towards the lobby and towards Israel. And one can argue that if Joe Biden is defeated in November, and people attribute that defeat in part, or maybe in good part, to the lobby's efforts and Israel's efforts to undermine Biden's policies toward the Middle East during this crisis, that will have serious consequences for the Democratic Party's relationship with Israel and with the lobby moving forward. I'm not making the argument that that's going to happen for sure, but one does not want to underestimate what the potential consequences are of this crisis for the future of relations between the United States and Israel. This is not just a minor crisis. This is a crisis of huge proportions that has not played itself out yet. And how it does play itself out remains to be seen. And I'm just saying, I would not be surprised if the Democratic Party becomes much more hostile towards Israel in the future than it has been in recent years.
Well, just apropos that, what do you guys make of two recent developments? One is the majority leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer's recent comments, which many people think were constituted unprecedented criticism of a sitting Israeli prime minister. And then most recently, the Biden administration's 180-degree about face on calling for an immediate ceasefire at the United Nations. Is this evidence, John, that the Democratic Party may be at a glacial pace, but perceptibly moving in a different direction, do you think?
Let me make one very quick point and turn it over to Steve. What's very interesting in this regard, and supports what I said a few minutes ago, is that Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House, has hinted, if not said, that he plans to invite Netanyahu to speak before Congress. This is really quite remarkable. And by the way, it shows you how dysfunctional American foreign policy is. But the Biden administration has effectively made it clear that it would like to see Netanyahu replaced as Prime Minister of Israel. Chuck Schumer explicitly said that, and Biden has, in effect, endorsed what Chuck Schumer said. This is the Democratic Party interfering in electoral politics inside of Israel. And it shows you how desperate the Democrats are to put an end to this war. On the other hand, the Republicans see this as an opportunity to drive a wedge between Democrats and Israel and push Israel and its supporters into the Republican column. And this is why I said relations between the Democratic Party and Israel could change in significant ways over time.
What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I think, first of all, Schumer's speech, which is really a remarkable development given where he has been throughout his political career. And Schumer is a very sort of, ear to the ground, connected to local politics in lots of ways. I think it's a sign that he understands that opinion is shifting. Second, I think this was a speech that, in my view, probably did not happen without the White House being aware that he was going to give it. I'm sure he cleared this with the White House. And of course, they've been looking to find whatever ways they could to signal their displeasure with the Netanyahu government. And this was a way of doing it without having Blinken or Biden having to come out and say it, but it clearly sent that signal. But I also think that this reflects a view, a genuine view, and I think Schumer probably shares this, that Netanyahu's handling of the events in Gaza has been a disaster for Israel. That I think Schumer was sincere when he said, this leadership is bad for Israel. I'm someone who loves Israel. I'm as pro-Israel as any member of the Senate, and I think that what the Israeli government is doing is ultimately harmful to Israel. So, it's a form of tough love, I guess. And of course, many Israelis believe that too. And of course, there is the argument that one of the reasons Netanyahu wants the war to continue and is continuing to pursue it is that he understands that once you get a ceasefire, once you get peace, the day of reckoning for him is coming quickly, given how unpopular he is, given how some of his actions undoubtedly made October 7th more likely, et cetera. And of course, the war itself has been an enormous black eye to Israel's image. I think Schumer believes all of those things. And so, for him to give that speech makes sense. Just one final point, though. There is a strategy you see now deployed all over the place, and it bears noting, which is that to blame this entirely on Bibi Netanyahu. That the problem here is we just had a different Israeli prime minister. If we get, somebody else in there, then this problem would go away. And I think that's naive, right? Because, of course, worth noting that Israeli public opinion mostly supports what Netanyahu is doing. They don't like him very much anymore, but they're supporting the war up until now. And Netanyahu is the most moderate member of his cabinet. right? So you're not going to see a sea change in Israeli policy. You're not going to see a sudden embracing of a two-state solution if Benjamin Netanyahu left office tomorrow. And one of the focus on Netanyahu is a way of distracting everybody from the fact that there's a much more fundamental structural and political issues involved in Israel itself, deep divisions, increasingly a hard line, and very unsympathetic, especially in the wake of October 7th, to doing anything to address the Palestinian issue.
I would just say you cannot emphasize enough the importance of what Steve just said. I mean, this argument that you hear among many of Israel's supporters in the United States that Benjamin Netanyahu is the problem, and if only we get rid of him, everything will be okay, is simply wrong. As Steve said, he is not on the right-hand side of the political spectrum in his cabinet.
He's the moderate voice in the coalition.
You remember recently Benny Gantz, who is a very key figure in the war cabinet and a deep opponent of Netanyahu, came to the United States. And the United States, or the Biden administration, was expecting that Gantz would distance himself from Netanyahu on the key policy issues of the day. And what actually happened is that Gantz made it clear that he agreed with Netanyahu completely on what Israel was doing vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And the idea that if you got rid of Netanyahu and put Gantz in his place, that Israel policy would change was not true. That Gantz was, he was shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu on what the right policy was for dealing with the Palestinians. And of course, also, as Steve alluded to, as time goes by, Israel will become more hardline on the Palestinian issue. And not simply because of what happened on October 7th and subsequently, but also because the political center of gravity in Israel has been moving steadily to the right over time. And there is no reason to think that it won't continue to move more and more to the right over time. And all of this tells you that the Israel lobby is going to have to work harder and harder over time to keep this present relationship between the United States and Israel intact.
I read somewhere that the Israel lobby, the book, has been translated into 24 languages. Is that your most widely translated book? And where I'm going with this is, it seems to me that, your basic argument was quite controversial when it came out in the United States and maybe Western Europe, that in a lot of places around the world, the argument was not at all controversial. Maybe some people would say was the conventional wisdom. How do you see the global view on the role of the lobby?
I'll let John take the first swing at that, although I have some thoughts.
I just got back from India yesterday, and there's no question that huge numbers of Indians believe our basic argument about the lobby. That's certainly true in China and all sorts of other countries, which one would categorize these days as the global South. It's certainly true in the Middle East outside of Israel. And I would argue that inside of Israel, our basic argument is appreciated by or understood by many Israelis. They understand the importance of the lobby, and they're quite blunt in talking about that influence. The place where you're going to run into the most resistance is obviously the United States and Western Europe. Those are the two places where there'll be significant resistance to our argument. But that's not to say that in the United States and in Western Europe, there aren't a lot of people who identify with our argument.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just add that, in the American context, this is actually an old story, right? There are many ethnic lobbies. And in fact, countries like India understand this and are actively trying to promote political groups in the United States, like in the American Political Action Coalition, which resembles AIPAC and in fact has tried to learn from AIPAC how to do business. So this is the way a melting pot society works, whether it's, Cuban Americans, Greek Americans, Ukrainian Americans, etc. We've been like this for a long time, and the Israel lobby is just the most effective of these movements, I think, by far. Just to echo something John said, I actually think that many people understood what we said from the very beginning was exactly right, or largely right. Anybody who'd ever worked on Capitol Hill understood how this operated, and you could talk to staffers, and they would tell you stories, some of which we used in the book as well. So it was widely understood. I had a colleague who said that, to me once, that we got in trouble for saying that AIPAC and others were extremely good at doing exactly what AIPAC and others said they were trying to do. And lots of former American politicians, once they left office, once they retired, would talk rather candidly about what it was like to face pressure from the lobby. So we weren't saying anything that didn't resonate with lots of people's experiences. The point is that people didn't want to say it out loud because there would be professional consequences. And fortunately, John and I were in a position that we could do this. We could write this without losing our jobs, without having our futures, completely turned upside down. And one of the reasons we did it was that we were in a position to say what many people believed, but for their own reasons had chosen not to say out loud.
And the position you were in is as tenured, endowed professors at two of the nation's leading academic institutions.
Right. We'd peaked.
I'm not sure John will agree that he's peaked, but I want to ask you two about the particular nature of the taboo about talking about the lobby, because, if I were to say, I think the Polish vote had a non-trivial effect on Bill Clinton in terms of his support of the first round of NATO expansion, a lot of our former neighbors on the south side of Chicago would probably not be happy about that, but the implications of that, for me professionally would be far less serious than what you guys faced for raising or breaking the taboo, grabbing the third rail. I think I heard both of you compare this to at some point in talking about what you were doing. Why is the Israel lobby different and so much harder to talk about in terms of ethnic politics and interest group politics? Is it just AIPAC, or is there something else there in addition?
I think the thing that makes it really difficult is the long history of anti-Semitism in the Christian West, and things like the protocols of the Elders of Zion, these various conspiracy theories about how Jews had magical powers to, influence politics. They've secretly controlled the world in a variety of ways, and they did it, in all sorts of nefarious fashions for their own dastardly purposes. That is a horrible history. It led, obviously, to many tragic events in the world, most notably the Holocaust. And when you have that as the backdrop, right, then anyone who comes in and talks about the political influence of not just, as we made it clear, not just American Jews, but groups that are heavily populated by Jews who cared a lot about Israel for all sorts of obvious reasons. Once you start bringing that up, once you start talking about the mechanisms by which these groups operate, you're inevitably going to trigger the sense that maybe you're making some kind of anti-Semitic argument. it's also true that groups in the lobby have used the accusation of anti-Semitism as a way to marginalize, smear, silence, deter people as well. And we wrestled with this a lot, just made it clear that we were not talking about a cabal. We were not talking about a conspiracy. We were talking about interest group politics. Again, as American as apple pie, we used to say. But you were inevitably, I think, going to face those kinds of accusations, partly because of this long, centuries-long history, but also because it was a very effective way of trying to marginalize people and get the others not to pay attention to what we were saying.
If I can just add a couple points to this. First of all, Mike, we're not just talking and criticizing the lobby. We are also talking about and criticizing Israel. And we're talking about and criticizing the U.S. Israeli relationship, right? So if we just did a study of the lobby and the Israel lobby and compared it to, say, the NRA and the Cuban lobby, that would be one thing. But we're not doing that. We're talking about the Israel lobby, we're talking about the U.S. Israeli relationship, and we're talking about Israeli behavior. So in a sense, we're grabbing 3/3 rails at the same time. And that's going to get you into a well of a lot of trouble. Second point I'd make is you just don't want to underestimate how effective the lobby is. I mean, I have enormous respect for the lobby in the sense that these are remarkably smart and clever individuals who work overtime, who are relentless about pushing the United States in a pro-Israel direction. And they are just really good at what they do. They have resources, they have smarts, and on and on. So you just don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is a really formidable bunch of individuals and groups, right, that understand how the American political system works and have been profoundly effective at influencing American policy towards the Middle East, and in particular, American policy toward Israel.
As anybody who's followed the Israel lobby controversy over the last 18 years knows, you guys have paid some price in metaphorical blood and heartburn for sure. I think probably people don't realize the full extent of it. Would you do it all over again?
No question. I actually think it's the part of my career I'm proudest of. Partly because I think it stands up as a piece of scholarship, but also because I would have felt much worse if we had thought about doing this and had decided not to because of the potential consequences.
John?
I agree completely with what Steve said. And I would just add to that, I think it's very important in a liberal democracy to make it work, that you have institutions where you have particular groups of people who are free to speak truth to power, who are free to make controversial arguments and not be punished in a truly serious way. I believe that this is why freedom of the press is so important. You want to have a media that's filled with people who are free to criticize the government. This is not to say they won't make foolish or wrong-headed statements from time to time. That may be true. But you want institutions that can critique the powers to be. Now, with regard to me and Steve, we are tenured professors at elite universities. The reason that we have tenure is so that we are free to make critical comments about U.S. foreign policy or U.S. domestic policy without losing our job. So I believe that we have an ethical responsibility to make controversial arguments. Of course, we have to think that those controversial arguments are true. And in the case of the lobby, Steve and I believed what we said. We thought there was a huge amount of empirical evidence that supported our argument, and we made it. We understood full well from the get-go that we were going to pay a certain price for this, that there was going to be an enormous amount of criticism. Of course, until that wave of criticism hit us, I don't think we fully appreciated how big the wave would be. But nevertheless, we knew that we would be attacked for writing the original article and then writing the book. But we did it because I think we felt that we had a social responsibility as tenured professors to speak out on this issue in what I think was a level-headed way. It's not like we were, on an anti-Semitic rampage or something like that, where we hated Israel and trying to do everything we could to delegitimize it. We thought there were important policy issues at play here that needed to be addressed and that people were ignoring or not talking about, in large part because it was so controversial and they would get into so much trouble. So we decided that we would write the article. And again, to get back to his initial response, Steve's initial response, I think that we did the right thing, and I am proud of what I did.
Well, this is an excellent note to end our discussion on. Behind Professor Mearsheimer in the background is a handsome pen and ink sketch or caricature of the two guests, Walt and Mearsheimer. Is that from the London Review of Books behind your shoulder there, John?
No, that's from the New Yorker.
From the New Yorker.
Yeah, the New Yorker. I believe David Remnick, who is the editor of the New Yorker, wrote a story about the lobby book or the lobby article. And this was the sketch that was done for that article. And that is actually the original sketch by the artist.
Maybe if it doesn't violate copyrights, you might let us use a picture as part of our promotional materials for this podcast. So in any case, just a quick thanks again to John and Steve for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat about this. Trip down memory lane, but a tribute to the book that after 18 years, unfortunately, it's as relevant as it was in 2008. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Mike.